Hey guys, welcome to our daily encounter. In Job 31, Job asserts his integrity. He is basically combating this idea that somehow he had sinned, he had somehow transgressed God's law, and that's why he was enduring the hardships that he was enduring. And this chapter is very useful for us to kind of give us a list of, what it means to be pure and what it means to live a righteous life. As Job describes his own life and uses it to show how blameless he was, we can use it as somewhat of a template or a guide for our own lives to kind of check ourselves to see, are we living a life of purity, of morality, and of righteousness? And the first thing that he mentions in this chapter is sexual purity. He begins by saying, I have made a covenant with my eyes. How then could I gaze at a virgin? And then later on in verse 9, he says, if my heart has been enticed by a woman, or I have lurked at my neighbor's doorway, may my wife grind for another and let others kneel down over her. And several verses such as that in this section show that Job had made a covenant with his eyes. He had determined not only to not physically commit adultery, but also not to commit adultery with his eyes, as Jesus would later talk about in the Sermon on the Mount. But then also, he treated others fairly, especially those who were of a lower social class than him, and those who were subservient to him. In verse 13, he says, if I have despised the claim of my male or female slaves when they filed a complaint against me, what then could I do when God arises? And when he calls me to account, what will I answer him? Did not he make me in the womb, make him? And the same one fashioned us in the womb? So he even viewed those who were his servants, those who were below him socially, economically, but even in status there at the house. He treated them fairly and recognized the fact that the same God that made him made them as well. And so part of being righteous and living a pure life is treating other people fairly and not looking down on people, despising people, especially based on their social class or their race or anything like that, but just treating people fairly. And then he goes on to talk about benevolence, how he was so helpful to those who were in need. He mentions the poor. He also mentions the orphan, the widow. He had helped all those who were, disadvantaged, as we might say, or just didn't have the necessary means for the day-to-day needs that they had. Job was there to help them, and he never turned a deaf ear to them. He never turned away from them, but had open hands to helping those who were less fortunate than him. And he was always benevolent. And that definitely is a part of living a righteous life. Looking around and meeting the needs of people around us, not ignoring them, not turning away from them, but being willing to be helpful, to be generous to other people. And then he also didn't trust in his riches, even though he was very wealthy at some point in his life. That was not where he placed his trust. He said in verse 24, if I have put my confidence in gold and called fine gold my trust, if I have gloated because my wealth was great and because my hand had secured so much. And then he goes on. And of course, he's implying that he did not do those things. Job followed what Paul had told Timothy to teach the rich there at his church in Ephesus in 1 Timothy chapter 6, to not trust in riches. Riches are not, can come and go. They are not something that we can have confidence in. We might be rich today and poor tomorrow. The book of Job definitely teaches us that. And Job never really trusted in his riches. He enjoyed them as a blessing from God, but never put his trust ultimately in those things, and neither should we. If we find ourselves in a situation where maybe we experience some affluence and some wealth, we just don't place our trust in that. And even if we're poor, if we think that getting rich is going to solve all of our problems, we could also trust in wealth even though we're not wealthy. But he also experienced and exercised spiritual purity. It's very similar to the sexual purity, but here in regards to God and things of a spiritual nature. He says in verse 26, if I have looked at the sun when it shone, or the moon going in splendor, and my heart became secretly enticed, and my hand threw a kiss from my mouth, that too would have been iniquity, calling for judgment, for I would have denied God above. So just as in sexual purity he had made covenant with his eyes, he kind of did that with spiritual purity, in that he wasn't going to look at the sun or look at the moon in a way in which he would be tempted to worship them. He wouldn't throw them a kiss, but his relationship spiritually was tied to God and God alone, and he didn't worship other things. And then he loved his enemies. In verse 29 it says, have I rejoiced at the extinction of my enemy, or exulted when evil befell him? Again, it's tied to the Sermon on the Mount, but we're taught by Jesus to love our enemies, not to hate them, but to love them, to do good for them. Romans chapter 12 talks about that, not returning evil for evil, but rather a blessing. And in doing so, we will heap coals of fire upon their head, just doing what is good for other people, even for our enemies. Job did that, and we should as well. And then lastly, he talks about how he was very hospitable. In verse 32, he says, the alien has not lodged outside, for I have opened my doors to the traveler. And we too should have open doors. One of the best ways that we can share the gospel with people is when we open up our lives to people and we invite people in. It's then that they can not only hear us speak about Jesus, but also see us live Jesus. And when we have open hearts and open doors to those who are in need, we can better interact with them and have a good platform by which we can share the gospel. There's a book out called The Gospel Comes with a Key, I think is the title of it. And it's all about that, using hospitality as a means by which we share the gospel, by having our neighbors over for a barbecue, by having them over for various activities. We can open up the door for sharing the gospel with them. And so hospitality is a big part of living a spiritual life and a life of purity and righteousness. And so all these things Job had going for him in his life. Sexual purity, he treated other people fairly, he exercised benevolence, he didn't trust in his riches, he had spiritual purity, he loved his enemies, and then he also exercised hospitality. And of course, this isn't an exhaustive list of things that we do as we're living a righteous life, but they're a pretty good start to living a life that God wants us to live, a life that is pleasing to him, and one in which we can look back and say, yeah, I'm definitely living a life that I'm called to live as I live out this relationship with God that I have. So these are some things we can reflect on and think about as we read Job 31. With that, guys, I do thank you for watching the video today. Hope you guys have a great day. Love you guys. God bless.